Presentation, and then at Michigan State and at Indiana. She's the author of a great many scholarly works, all with important practical implications. Her focus has been on the quality of education, on teacher training, on school choice, and on the intersection between health and education. And today she'll be talking about assessing quality in education and in the schools. Welcome, Professor Guarino.
Very much for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So I just want to, just a couple of disclaimers. So I didn't know quite how to plan this talk for the audience. So what I'm doing is kind of an overview of the issue of measuring school and teacher effectiveness. And if you want to get into the technical details, invite me back for round 2, and I will do a more technical talk. And you're also welcome to ask me any of the technical questions you would like. All right, so I just want to give a lot of background here so you kind of understand the controversy and what's been going on. So basically, as of 2002, when we had the passage of No Child Left Behind under George W. Bush, it really ushered in this era of accountability for schools. There was the establishment of widespread educational standardized testing and strings attached to not doing well if you were a school. Okay, so the federal government gives out Title I funds for economically disadvantaged students, socioeconomically disadvantaged students, and so the government, even though it doesn't provide an enormous share, it provides a relatively small share of funding for education. It can leverage that share of funding enormously by attaching strings to the money it gives out. So, school accountability began under No Child Left Behind, and then in the 2009 to 2015 era, teacher accountability starts to take off. That's under the Obama administration with the race to the top and flexibility waivers, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. And then late 2015, we have the new reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act under Obama. It's called the Every Student Succeeds Act, so I will probably refer to it as ESSA. And that eases off teacher accountability but retains school accountability. So I'm going to go into this all in a little bit more detail, but this is kind of like the thumbnail sketch. So here's, the beginning. NCLB, it was signed. It was bipartisan in its authorship, and the stated purpose was closing the achievement gap with accountability, flexibility, and choice so that no child is left behind. So it really just brought in this era of controversy over accountability. Main provisions were that schools were required to bring all students to proficiency by 2014. I usually, when I talk about this with my students, I usually stop and say, well, what do you think of that? Well, as we all know, 2014 came and went, and certainly not all students in the country were proficient. In the interim, schools were required to make adequate yearly progress, called AYP. And then the states were given flexibility to determine what constituted AYP within certain requirements. So here were the requirements. They had to, so a school had to do well basically on standardized tests for not only for all of its students on average, but for also, the various subgroups of students, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, and English learners. If a school did not make AYP, there was kind of a long train of successive things that had to take place, and if they didn't make AYP for 6 consecutive years, it's possible that they could be closed. Okay, so it wasn't the shortest. I mean, it's not terribly stringent in the sense that there were 6 years to try to make AYP. However, making AYP was not easy. So, like in California, the AYP calculation. So again, there was all this variation. The states could vary in the way they decided to compute its AYP, and they even had different state testing systems. So the tests were not uniform across states. So in California, they usually had something like an annual measurable objective, which is related to proficiency on standardized tests. It also had this academic performance index, which was based on proficiency and growth on standardized tests. And if it was a high school, there were graduation rates also. So a lot of schools were failing to make AYP. And of course, states could sort of tinker with these rates by making it easier or harder. But since they all had this goal of needing to get to full proficiency in 2014, they couldn't get away with making it easy all the time. So eventually they had to ratchet up the difficulty to try to, to raise the achievement of students. So like in 2011, 48% of the schools in the U.S. were listed as not making AYP. And California was worse. 66% of schools did not make AYP in 2011. So it was difficult. So then what happens when Obama takes over and there are some opportunities here to move the theory of action a bit away from the school to the teacher. So Arne Duncan, who was Obama's longest-serving education secretary, really believed that teachers were the key elements of schooling. Those were the key movers of student learning. And schools and districts, he felt needed to measure how effective teachers were. So the idea was, well, if we can measure how effective schools are on the basis of how well the students are doing on tests, why can't we measure how effective teachers are on the basis of how their students are doing on tests? He had two unprecedented vehicles to promote his reform: Race to the Top and the flexibility waivers. So the Race to the Top, as many of you may know, was a contest. He started in 2009 using the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds. That was the stimulus, because as you recall, at the end of 2008, we plunged into what is now known as the Great Recession. And so Congress passed all of the stimulus money. A lot of it was doled out for education, and then Arne Duncan was given a fair amount of discretionary funding, and so he could use that funding to push the kind of things that he wanted to do. So the other opportunity he had was that the impossible to meet provision that all students have to be brought up to proficiency in 2014 left him with the ability to say, well, I'll grant you a waiver from that. So, because, technically, if schools were out of compliance with the law, they hadn't met that proficiency rate, then technically they would have to refund all the Title I funding. So he was able to use this in a way to grant flexibility waivers to the states. And of course, all of the states, would have needed a waiver. Not all of them applied. California was one that didn't, but there were some districts in California that did. So anyway, so basically, the way he set it up was to win the contest, the Race to the Top contest, or to get a waiver, the states had to show they had a plan for improving instruction that included evaluating and supporting teachers and principals, and the evaluations had to have a student test score component. Okay, so this is where the teacher evaluation starts to come in now. And by doing this, he promoted a lot of change. There were many states that didn't have, they had laws against linking the teachers to the students to be able to see what the students of a teacher were doing. And some states just changed the law in order to be able to compete. So, all right, so now let's get into the actual question. Well, how do you assess? Let's start with effective teaching, and then we'll talk about effective schools later. So the two main methods are looking at the outcomes of a teacher's students. So you want to estimate the teacher's contribution to student achievement using some kind of a statistical, like what we might call a value-added model. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And the other method would be to observe a teacher in action and form some kind. You could either form some kind of subjective opinion, as in the traditional principles evaluations. So principals will walk into a classroom, maybe for 5 minutes or whatever, and stand there and listen to the teacher and then make a judgment about how effective the teacher was. That's the old days. Or using some kind of a quality rating rubric, which is what's more popular right now. We'll talk about that more later too. So most teacher evaluation systems today combine both types of measures, although some of them don't have any value-added component. So some of them dispense with the test score stuff altogether. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what value-added is. So the idea is to determine the value that a teacher has added over the course of the year, and we're talking about value in terms of improving student achievement, okay? Something that's measurable. And it always, value added always takes prior achievement into account. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's just look at a really simple example. Here are 2 teachers, 10 students in the class. You can see in this Mrs. Jones class, the average score for students is 218 on the test. And in Ms. Smith's class, the average score is 335. So which one has higher achieving students? Ms. Smith, right? Okay, so does that mean Ms. Smith is a better teacher? We don't know, right? Because we don't know how prepared these students were when they came into her class. So the idea about value added is, well, let's take prior test scores into account. So if you take, so this is the same column that I had on the previous slide, and then you take the prior year test score, so that just before they came into Ms. Smith's class, the year before that when they were with somebody else, this is what they scored, and then you take the difference between, you get this difference, and then you look at the average difference in the test scores. And so you're looking at the average gain score of students in Mrs. Jones' class would be 44.9, whereas for Ms. Smith, the average gain is 36.8. Okay, so now which one would you say is the more effective teacher? Now it's like Mrs. Jones, right? Seems like she's the one that's maybe a candidate for being considered the more effective teacher. But are student learning gains all due to the teacher? So like what other factors might contribute to this growth? And feel free to shout out if you I usually like to have interactive talks, and I'm happy to just proceed by talking and then taking questions afterwards. But anyway, well, there could be the families themselves may be doing all sorts of work with the kids in one class versus another, one teacher's class versus another. They could be hiring tutors. There could be the peers in the class that are sort of helping the kids along or harming the kids. There could be just the kids' own efforts and abilities may make it different for how much they can actually grow or learn in a class, regardless of the teacher. Difference in a student ability or disabilities in neighborhood environments, etc. So there are a lot of reasons why you may get a higher gain score for one teacher versus another, right? You don't want like a simple Neanderthal gain score model when you're trying to do this kind of work. However, that gain score model is already better than just looking at average test scores, right? And you would be surprised to learn that it's not unusual for districts to actually evaluate teachers on average test scores. And some of the better value-added models can actually adjust for some of these factors, so they can kind of remove some bias in the measure that comes through the fact that you have some of this stuff going on. But people are still worried that, you know, what's this number telling us? Is it really a good measure of teacher effectiveness? So there's been a lot of controversy about it. So it was a point of contention in the 2012 Chicago teacher strike. There have been public releases of teacher value-added scores that have really angered teachers and unions. The LA Times published measures in 2010. For a couple years, they were publishing measures for LAUSD teachers in grades 3 to 5 on the web. I'll show you in a second what that looks like. In New York City, the Wall Street Journal published measures for grades 4 through 8 after 2012. So here's like the LA Times example. So I just pulled off and just wrote in a name. It's not anybody I knew. I just like guessed. You know, I put in the name Martinez, then I chose Claudia, and you know, this was the value-added score that was recorded for her in 2010. okay? So in math. So they had math and they probably had English language arts too. So she was rated as less effective in math teaching on this, okay? And then the sort of shadiness here is kind of indicating, well, you know, we don't really know how strongly different she is from other teachers, but as you go further out, we know that she is very different from, like, she's probably, you know, very statistically different from the more effective teachers, according to the model they used, okay? So, I mean, how would you feel if this were published about you? You know, and you can go on the web and look you up and things like that. Well, you'd want to be darn sure that it was, like, telling the truth, right, number one, and there wasn't something wonky about it, and, you know, that would be number one, but you'd also could be demoralized. I mean, there was a case where a teacher committed suicide, and they said part of that, his, you know, value-added score was one of the things that sent him over the edge, and I mean, you know, there's a lot of controversy and stress that came out of this kind of publication. And of course, in New York, the unions they took out a big, you know, ad saying this is no way to rate a teacher, and they put this thing that I guess is supposed to horrify people. I think it's a pretty tame looking equation, but you know, you know, you know, it was supposed to give people this sense of, oh, these, you know, weird Greek letters and things are being used to evaluate teachers and what's going on. So, so there was a lot of controversy, a lot of pushback going on all this time. And the public release did not help matters at all. If anything, it created more backlash. So what are the pros and cons of using value added for teacher evaluation? Well, let's talk about some pros. Well, first of all, they are based on outcomes we care about, because we do care about how much students are learning. They're data-driven, so they're more potentially objective than just a principal standing and watching a teacher perform in a classroom, so they're objective. They can be better than rewards to teachers based solely on experience and education. So back in the day, I mean, and actually still today in many, many places, particularly here in California, you know, teachers just got a raise every year based on what step they were on in the salary scale, which was, you know, it was like how many years of education you'd had and how many years of experience you had. And depending on what step you were in, that was your salary. So there was nothing in there about merit or effectiveness. Okay. And there wasn't a lot of research to bear out that effectiveness was correlated with these education and experience levels, okay? There's some research, particularly on the experience, but it is certainly not a linear relationship, so it was kind of weak. So there was this, that was the reason why we had this big push to measure effectiveness directly. Again, the value-added measures are relatively economical since we have standardized tests everywhere now since NCLB. Cons. Well, first of all, these measures can be very imprecise due to small numbers of students per teacher. So if you did this for each teacher every year on the basis of the class that teacher had, well, how many students does a teacher have in a year? Like maybe 20, 50, 40 at the most, but like small numbers, right? And anybody who's taken statistics knows that, you know, you don't get very reliable estimates when you've got a small number of observations in your equation. So there's that issue, but there's some ways to get around it by like averaging, you know, taking teachers' scores for like 3 running years in a row or something like that. Then there can be inaccurate matching, so our data systems may not catch that maybe a student just got into that teacher's class the last month because it was a mobile student, you know, like somebody who moved from another school. So there's that issue, that it's not necessarily, it's only as clean as our data systems are. But, you know, more importantly, I mean, people are worried that the measures may be based on tests that may not measure everything we really want students to know. So if you're not a proponent of what the tests are testing, if you don't believe the quality of the tests are totally up to snuff, then, you know, you may worry more about these measures. And also these particular kinds of measures, they don't really give teachers a lot of information about like what's where are their weak areas, or, I mean, you could do some subscales and look at different types of things on the items on the test, but it's more than most districts ever do. So a lot of research has gone into looking at how good these measures are, and there have been a lot of approaches to that. So experimental approaches, meaning like they'll randomly assign teachers to students and take their value added, and then they'll compare that to like the value added that they had before they were randomly assigned to students. And so those kinds of studies kind of show that the measures are decent. They do send a credible signal. They do, but there is some noise in them. So definitely in the sort of like large scale, if you want to look at teacher qualifications or something like that and look at the relationship of their value added to something else, fine. If you want to drill down to one particular teacher and say for this particular teacher, you're either highly effective or not, they're a lot weaker. Simulation studies where you kind of like set out all the parameters and you kind of know what the teacher quality is from the get-go because you created it. Those will show you that some approaches are much better than others. That's a lot of the kind of research I've done. I'll talk a little more about that in a second. And then when we look at over time, like when we look at what teachers get, how they get valued over time, we find that there's a lot of instability in the measures. And the instability can be greater for teachers who teach low-performing students. Because low-performing students actually, they themselves tend to be a lot more variable in their test scores from year to year. My particular research looks at the strengths and weaknesses of different value-added models, and we find that some models are less biased than others. So we have our favorites. And I was talking to Dr. Kravitz about this because there are really important reasons why you should use certain models and not other models. Surprisingly, the best methods are not necessarily the most widely used. Weaker, more biased computations are more popular. This holds for both teacher and school evaluation. All right, let's talk a little bit about the other way of assessing teacher effectiveness, and that is through classroom observations, which are increasingly being used as teacher evaluation measures. So at this point, nearly all teacher evaluations use some form of classroom observation. As I said before, it used to be that the principals would walk into the class for a few minutes, observe a teacher, and give a rating of satisfactory or not, something like that. But now we've gotten more scientific about it. And there's pressure to be like more discriminating and systematic, so there have been a lot of these rubrics designed to help guide the process. So the most famous perhaps is the Framework for Teaching, the FTT, which it covers these 4 domains: planning and preparation, classroom environment, instruction, and professional responsibilities. It's like if you look at the document, it's 104 pages long, and it's like dense with pedagogical information in it. And so what happens is somebody will, the trained rater, somebody who's trained on the rubric, will go into a classroom and with the rubric or study a video or something of the teacher's teaching, and they'll like check off, the amount of engagement in the classroom, like how many questions are being asked, or things like that. It very, very rarely do they ever get at content or like if the teacher's giving the right answer or not, that sort of thing. It's kind of hard for a rater to do. And some of the math rubrics try to do that, but it's hard. So basically what they mainly get at is a lot of classroom management and classroom planning and that sort of thing. And despite the measures of effective teaching, the MET project, which was funded by Gates, they studied 5 different types of these rubrics, and they gave extensive training to the raters, but despite that, they still had a lot of problems with inter-rater reliability. They weren't very reliable in that sense. The rubrics varied from rubric to rubric on the same lesson. They varied from lesson to lesson for the same teacher using the same rubric. So it's just hard to get a reliable score from the rubrics. And so what they do usually is they'll try to do at least 4 of these observations and combine them, and that helps bring the reliability numbers up. So pros and cons of using these, well, it provides a systematic analytic guide to effective teaching. It does, in contrast to the value added, it gives teachers helpful information regarding their teaching, because they can see, well, this is where you slipped up on your rubric, or this is where you need to improve, or this is where you're doing great. So in that sense, they're great. They form the basis for professional development. They engage teachers and administrators in a dialogue over instruction, which is something that wasn't happening as much before all of this. On the other hand, the scoring is subject to variability and subjectivity. The measures of pedagogy may not necessarily measure how much students learn. So there could be a teacher who's seemingly, great, very, engaging and all this kind of stuff, but maybe not a whole lot of real information or knowledge is being gained by the students. So, they're not necessarily, and in fact, when we try to correlate these things with value-added measures, the correlations are not very high. I mean, they're positive, but they're not as high as you would want. It's time-consuming to train and implement, so therefore it's expensive. It's burdensome for school administrators. I know when I was in Indiana, the principals were just like, principals and assistant principals who were doing this, it's just like their workload had doubled. They were very, very stressed about it. But at the same time, they liked the fact that they had gone back into the role of instructional leader, particularly the elementary level. The high school level, it's a whole different story. But so you can see these are dogged by many problems. And there's also, when I was talking with the students, we talked about this issue of bias. So the types of students you get in the class can bias these measures just as much as they could bias like a value-added measure. Okay, so there's a lot of variation in how these two, observations and value-added sort of things are combined. And let me just say something. So I tend to use value-added in the more general terms. So value-added became a dirty word in national, the education policy forum. So a lot of schools will use something that they call a growth model instead of a value-added model or something. But it's like semantics, really, because they're all trying to get at a value-added. But they are, usually the growth models are a little differently computed, but they're still taking prior test scores into account, which is the main feature of something where you're trying to get at value added. Okay, and the growth models are not as good as the regular, as my favorite value-added models. Okay, so California is pretty weak in terms of promoting teacher evaluation. At least it's very hard to link test scores to teachers in California. So one of the more holdout states in that regard. Whereas in Indiana, they were all on top of it. It was like a very, very pro-accountability type state. New York City Public Schools, I was just talking to somebody there the other day, and they're using, actually the value-added part of it is like 40%. And it's actually not a value-added part. It's average test scores, which seems to me totally crazy. But anyway, that was 40% of the teacher evaluation is a test score base, but not a value-added model. Anyway, and then DC Public Schools and a lot of other places are using them. Much more assertive and making much more use of the quantitative measures. But even in the states and the districts that use student test scores to evaluate teachers, they're always counterbalanced by observation scores. So, like even in Indiana, it never was more than, I think the most it could get up to was 35% of a teacher's overall evaluation score was the part based on the growth model. So, although they told me in New York it's 40%, these average test scores are 40%. Can you imagine? You get low-performing students in your class, and not low value added, but low-performing students, and you're, lower than the teachers who got, the highly prepared students. It just doesn't seem fair at all, if my information from this person was correct. Um, and it's so hard to go on the web and figure out exactly what these states and districts do. Believe me, I've tried many, many times. So, and so the irony of it is that with all this effort and upheaval and tension and everything, we're still getting very few teachers rated as ineffective, just like before we started all of this stuff. But it could be that, and it, a lot of it's because these classroom observations can come in, and even if you have a low value added score, they can come in and, they're still pretty subjective. They can still come in and raise you up. In some cases, they're like 75% or more of the total score. So it's kind of an interesting policy question to consider is all this effort, did it lead to a good result? Well, like, what were the good things that came out of it? Well, maybe the fact that we have paying much more attention to instruction and the way it's carried out is a good thing, and maybe that has improved things overall. So in Washington, prior to the midterms in 2014, the Obama administration softened its attitudes towards using testing on accountability. So this is after tons and tons of backlash and anger, et cetera. And so here's Arnie Duncan saying, too much testing can rob school buildings of joy and cause unnecessary stress. This issue is a priority for us all. We will continue to work throughout the fall on efforts to cut back on over-testing. And then he loosened up the requirements of the flexibility waivers to allow an extra year before you had to use test scores in teacher evaluation. So there was a kind of a stepping back from previous policies. And then when ESSA was passed in 2015, it continued the school evaluation, but at this point it did not include the teacher evaluation based on test scores. So that was gone from the policy. States and districts are still doing it in many cases, but it's no longer there's no longer a federal requirement for this or a federal push for this for the Title I fund. And so what ESSA did was add a new component to school evaluation. So it's continuing, with the testing in reading and math in grades 3 and once in high school, they still have to submit. The states still have to submit their accountability plans to ED. They can pick their own accountability goals measured against 4 indicators, which must include proficiency on tests, proficiency in English language, another academic indicator. But the new thing is this non-academic indicator, which is really an interesting movement, I think, in the right direction, is now we're looking at student engagement or school climate or safety or college readiness. So what we've done now is we've started collecting information on school safety or student behavior, suspensions, absences, et cetera. I'll show you in another slide. But we're now getting at something that's not just academic, because we've obviously kids and their development is more than just what they know and can spew out on the test, right? And then in California, with the local control funding formula, it really has shifted from the state to the local. I did not make up this slide. I just thought it was really pretty, so I took it from an online, publicly accessible presentation, giving attribution here. But it's just showing that they shifted the accountability to the local districts. So the state is not dictating as much as it did before. There's more local control. So the core districts in California are these districts here: Fresno, Garden Grove, LA, etc. And they've kind of been at the top of their game for a long time. So under the flexibility waivers, when California, where they were arguing whether or not they wanted to even ask the federal government for a waiver, the core districts, they were on top of it. They were developing their kind of school improvement plans and their school evaluation plans, et cetera. So they've been kind of at this for a while, and they've got so for their school effectiveness measures, they have an academic domain and a social, emotional, and culture climate domain. And so the academic domain is kind of like what AYP had before. So it's got achievement and growth, graduation rate, et cetera. But social emotion, this stuff is pretty new in terms of school effectiveness measures, right? So we've got now chronic absenteeism, parent, student, staff, parent culture climate surveys. They have suspensions and expulsion rates, which is super important because there's just been a lot more light shined recently on the school to prison pipeline and what's going on in terms of disciplinary actions. The social emotional skills and the English learner redesignation rate. So in other words, when kids are designated as English learners and then they can proceed out of the category. And then the special education and disproportionality and things. So it's interesting that they, these are what go into their measures now, and this is kind of going to be a model for what's going on statewide. So the new accountability plan in California is not going to provide a single school effectiveness number, but it's going to have this dashboard of multiple indicators similar to those in the core model. So that's what we're moving towards right now, is all of these. But, so there's a whole lot of stuff. I mean, so I think you probably feel like I do that that's great that we're getting these multiple measures. But there's a whole lot about, well, how are you weighting them? What weighs more than the other? What's more important? How do you determine? And all of them want to have cutoffs. They want to have categories. They want to know if a school is either highly effective, needs improvement, or ineffective. They want to have these. So how do you determine those cutoffs? Especially when you have multiple measures. Like there's a whole science around trying to determine this kind of measurement. Very, very difficult. So none of that, as far as I can tell, has been completely ironed out. Okay, so what have we learned here? Well, I think, what I've learned, it's important to keep the policy stakes low until the stakeholders become familiar with and see the usefulness of a measure. Okay, so what happens because of our political climate, everything is so short term that people come in and they want to really push what they want, right? But it's before it's been necessarily researched, before it's gotten buy-in. I think if you had that information out there, like if I were a teacher, I'd want to know what my value-added measures was, and I'd want to know that it was done on the right model. But I wouldn't necessarily want to have my score published on the web, or I wouldn't necessarily want to have, my salary depend on it until I got familiar with it and I felt I really did control, I really had control over it. So, or that it was really justified. So I think this is what we struggled with in this whole, teacher evaluation climate. Less so with the school evaluation, but there's a whole lot of controversy there as well that just hasn't come out to the degree that teacher evaluation brought it to the fore. It's also really important to find ways to include multiple measures of student development, social, emotional, behavioral, as well as academic, and find smart ways of combining those things and thinking about those things. And then this is just frustration, my part for the fact that why are so many states and districts using weaker models? It's kind of like things start and it's kind of like historical idiosyncratic development of models and things where some state, like there was the Colorado growth model, and that was one of the first ones, or the Tennessee value-added assessment system. And so then just like other states said, oh, well, they've done that, so let's just do it in our state. But there's research that might show that there are different methods that are better than some of these. And so I think that that's important to have, a really good scan of the research. But it's also, this is a dilemma that we researchers have in getting our points across. Like, how do we get out to the policymakers what we know or what we are learning? And it's hard, especially when you're dealing with a very technical type of subject. So I think that's all I have here. So I'd like to open it up to questions. Yes. No.